Wuthering Waves has been talked about, hyped about, and is currently in the center of most gacha players' attentions due to what it is and what it represents. It's an open world anime game with the potential to serve as a decent competitor to Genshin Impact. This is important to think about, as this game could not only change the landscape for Genshin, it can also by extension change the landscapes for gacha games as a whole, as it could pave the way for a new genre. However, with so much riding on its shoulders, it's also important to remember that these things are very volatile, and it's a good idea to keep your expectations tempered. Rome wasn't built in a day after all, and it was met with a lot of setbacks, compromises, and understandings. So I went into the game for a number of different reasons. For instance, I'm a fan of open world adventure games, as well as gacha games. I'm often looking out for the next one of the two categories, so naturally, Wuthering Waves was on my radar. The other reason, of course, is a little more complex. I wasn't that into Genshin Impact to begin with, and unfortunately, despite really wanting to enjoy it. The reasons I had were a little different than most, and why ultimately I probably won't be sticking with Wuthering Waves either. But for the clarity of this review, as well as warning, I didn't go into the game disenfranchised by Genshin. I also do not hate Genshin, and I would like to see both games grow as a result of one another. So bear in mind, my praises and criticisms are in no place of ill will or anger. These are my pure and honest thoughts of Wuthering Waves, and I do hope to see from it in the future, as well as the good and bad points of the game itself. I hope for it to improve. So, Wuthering Waves has been solid in terms of gameplay, both to the moment-by-moment combat encounters, as well as the potential for gameplay loop. The combat is very fluid, as well as engaging, as it offers two things in which I enjoy in action games, which is parrying and counterattacks. Genshin has these in select characters, I know, such as Beidou, Yunjin, and Candice. But not only are those incredibly limited in selection due to being 4 stars, you either have to pull them on rate up or just hope to get them in passing. They're also strict in their requirements to pull that off. Genshin is simply not made with such a playstyle in mind. However, Wuthering Waves seems to be, as parrying and countering are baked into the vast majority, if not all, of the characters. This makes combat feel more active and reactive. Very different to Genshin's, where the main playstyle that is supported seems to be playing with elemental reactions and cycling characters for their ultimates. This isn't quite a bad thing. It's just not a playstyle that I prefer. You could argue that Wuthering Waves simulates this with outro-intro effects, which are all about separate attacks based on swapping to another character. But I feel like it's less calculated to be cycled, as you need to dodge and land enough hits to build up concerto energy to begin with, and it gets consumed on swap, resulting in needing to play with a character long enough and not just using them as a battery or a chain reaction. I like parrying and counterattacks in action games, due to not only feeling like that I've paid enough attention to the enemy's moveset, but also being able to nail down the perfect timing in combat. It's a good exercise to not only have general awareness of the game itself, but also the character and surroundings. I do not feel like swapping movesets in a perfect cycle is interesting enough to keep me focused in an action game. It's a good way to study buildcraft and understanding how characters work, so it's a good lesson in mechanical knowledge. But I don't believe it works for reactivity. Simply put, there is no reactivity if you just have a circular prompt pre-established. The type of playstyle that I say Genshin tends to have is further established in its elemental reactions, as well as the type of pattern I reference, in the form of Hyperbloom, where all it takes is a team with an Electro, a Hydro, and a Dendro, in order to proc the strongest dot damage by purely cycling characters and abilities. Wuthering Waves doesn't have anything like that quite yet. Your main sources of damage seem to be breaking the toughness bar with enough parries and counterattacks, as further showcased in almost every boss fight of the game thus far. However, this does have the potential to change, and why I may no longer be interested in Wuthering Waves in the long term, as well as a few other points that I'll bring up later when I go over the negatives of the game itself. The reason this could change, though, is how Verena seems to work. She works like a Genshin character would. You cycle in with her intro, hit her ult, and then swap back. If more characters operate similar in later patches, it could change how the optimal way to play is instead more like Genshin's, and I'm not really interested in that. But another thing that Wuthering Waves does well is the tools added for exploration. Wall running as a mechanic is not only a breath of fresh air for an open world game, but it maintains the speed and pace for the player as well as genuinely feels like a skill to be mastered in its own right, due to how quickness and how stamina is consumed. It's not a travel mechanic that can be used lightly, as one can easily fall to their death if they're not careful with stamina usage. It's not much different than just climbing normally, it just feels better. Being able to run without consuming stamina unless you're in combat is also a welcome change, as even though the argument could be made that it could make the world feel smaller, I'd argue the map is still very big and adds more enjoyment to overall exploration. The last tool that I've come across, though, as a travel tool is the grappling hook, another way of scaling up very high places, with also some skill involved in timing, the pacing as well as the general awareness of the environment. Overall, it's not really much different to Genshin's exploration, but it's still an improvement, in my opinion, regardless. The problem that can arise, though, is the mundanity of said mechanics when it comes to environmental puzzles. For example, even though I just stated it as a positive, with the grappling hook, even though in itself is a unique addition, the actual grappling points are very straightforward and almost seemingly solve the puzzle by itself, with almost no forethought from the player. This leads to a lot of grappling hook puzzles feeling very boring and uninteresting. The last piece of praise that I have, though, is the ecosystem. It's not that much different from artifacts in Genshin, as each echo can be equipped and they have random stats that can roll with their capture. But I do have to give credit where credit's due for the twist upon their usage. The fact that you can summon or use any echo in the game as an extra skill, and some of them are transformations, add an extra layer of depth to build variety. The vast majority can also be acquired just by killing random monsters, with no daily energy required. On top of that, for even more customization of the cosmetic variety, there are also phantom versions, which are a unique color after capturing it, which then unlocks as a skin to attach onto any echoes of that variant you already have. This brings a type of shiny hunting feeling that fans of Pokemon may like, as an extra layer of something rare to obtain. Overall, I enjoy this system, and I look forward to dabbling in it a bit more. However, much like Genshin's artifacts, this can lead itself to be incredibly frustrating, even if the vast majority of the time it doesn't consume daily energy, as there is just no way to swing RNG more towards your favor. Mixed with the fact that some mobs may be difficult to farm echoes for due to their scarcity, location, or worse, respawn times. But now we move on to the negatives of Wuthering Waves. We really can't ignore the elephant in the room here. The optimization's really bad. They've been working on fixing it, but the fact remains that even on higher end PCs, the graphics stutter, as well as having issues holding 60 FPS. On phones, due to the nature of what engine they're using, it's unlikely that it'll be played on most phones for quite some time. This is a problem because this is primarily supposed to be a phone game. So if a lot of their potential audience is lost in the process, this isn't a good look. It just looks like the game's been rushed out without any real testing or quality control. As I said prior, they are currently in the middle of working towards fixing these issues, as well as they provided more than adequate compensation. The issue still, though, is the fact that it happened, and first impressions really do mean a lot. And then there's the matter of story. The story is barely coherent, as it likes to use a lot of terminology based on sound waves to describe esoteric concepts about the world. This would be a unique way to do storytelling if there was a more direct way to understand these concepts that they are talking about. But for most people, this comes off as confusing and hard to follow. This makes for the average viewer to not be invested into the story that much, because it's just harder to grasp and understand. There's a lot of world building potential, which I appreciate, but it's bogged down by purple prose that requires further investigation to actually form an idea of what's going on. It's not very easy to digest, and the payoff for said process, I'd argue, is not even worth it. Star Rail has this issue in some fashion, but a lot of the main story you can gloss over it, with the reward for paying attention is getting more nuance out of the world building if you choose to. Wuthering Waves, however, doesn't seem to have that luxury, as to understand the story, you have to understand the nuance. Overall, the story is just not framed well, and it's not very entertaining even if you do understand it. Finally, the last bit of criticism I have is how upgrading works for the ecosystem. This is a follow-up to my praise of it, but it required its own section to get into the real negatives of it. To put it simply, echoes come with 2 stats unlocked. Then it has 4 hidden substats at gold rank that you unlock using an item known as tuners. The echoes themselves are infinitely farmable, but tuners are required to unlock substats, and they cost daily energy to acquire. So there is a possibility that the substats on echoes could be bad on one you've saved, and you wouldn't know until you spend the items. The quest that you can get said item from also uses daily energy, which is rough, as you could potentially waste weeks worth of energy to find all the echoes that you've gathered to not be good, because the substats are nothing of what you needed. This is also further expounded by the fact that said item is sold in the shop. I find this distasteful, and it's the worst variant of a gear system in these kind of games. This frustration could be remedied by instead allowing substats to drop as is, and either leveling them requiring tuners, or a better proposition, if tuners could reroll substats. This would considerably cut out frustration, as the only worry would be the first 2 stats. You could have a full reroll of stats, or even better, select lines for easier ways of making what are known as god pieces. This would require testing and balancing, of course, as perhaps the perfect pieces that could be acquired too quickly could break the difficulty of the game. With this review out of the way, it's important to note that this is a live service game. There can and will be changes. It is important to keep our perspective in check when it comes to this. Kuro Games has shown that they're willing to take steps to fix the game, and it's very important to consider that the game can only improve from here despite its shortcomings. We need to remember that the goal for this game is to succeed, and succeeding is not beating Genshin Impact, but serving as a competent competitor. Wuthering Waves has to stand on its own game and provide itself as an alternative to Genshin, so that Genshin by extension will want to improve, and that will instead pave the way for other games like it in its space. If we want more open world anime gacha games, the best path forward is to play the ones that come out, provide both praise and criticism in equal measure, and more importantly, being patient for their cultivation. We're on the precipice of a new genre, and we have to be extra careful to make sure that it flourishes. And I, for one, would just love more genres in video games. Overall, though, I don't think I'll personally actively keep up with this game. It does do a lot of the same things as Genshin that I do find annoying, such as account level locking the storyline. I'm not a big fan of the character design either. There's only a few characters that I find aesthetically pleasing, and the others just seem relatively bland. The story not really resonating with me does hurt it in terms of long-term enjoyment. I'm not one to skip story cutscenes of any sort, and granted, I do appreciate that the function is there. I'd personally just rather not use it. I'll just opt to get a better story elsewhere. However, I'll probably log in every so often, fiddle with characters, and explore and nab chests. I look forward to seeing the game grow, though, as someone who holds no personal feelings for Genshin. And that's probably an important perspective to have for this kind of game anyway. So what do you think? You think my review was fair or unfair? Do you have any feedback? Please comment on the video below and feel free to share it around. Either way, thanks for hearing me out. Catch you later, maybe. Sorry for all the yapping.